Hello, I am excited to moderate this panel. I have been saying to them, and I'll say to you, this is kind of my developmental science, positive youth development dream team, and the kind of work they do that think about issues of resistance, issues of how we think about civic engagement, pro-social behavior, social justice, and moral reasoning. So, you guys are very lucky to have this panel, so to speak. So I'm going to quickly run through some introductions, and then I will leave as much time for them to get started. So Dr. Erin Metzger is an associate professor in lifespan development at the Psychology Department in West Virginia University. Dr. Metzger's research explores social cognitive aspects of civic development, including adolescent civic moral reasoning, conceptualizations of citizenship and political institution, and beliefs about civic behavior. In addition, he examines the developmental impact of adolescents' community service, political activity, and community and school organized activities. Dr. Janie Ward is the chair of the Education Department at Simmons University and chair of Africana Studies, a small interdisciplinary department that examines the histories and contemporary realities of African people across the diaspora. Dr. Ward's research focuses on developmental issues facing students of African descent in the U.S. She's currently working on a book entitled Sister Resistors that explores what it will take for white, largely female advisors on college campuses to support the healthy resistance of Black female college students. Dr. Larry Nucci is an adjunct professor in the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley and professor emeritus of educational psychology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He will be joining in through Skype. Nucci has published extensively on children's moral and social development and education. His 8 books include Nice is Not Enough, Facilitating Moral Development, a book that was awarded Book of the Year by the Moral Development and Education SIG of AERA, and Education in the Moral Domain. He is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Human Development and a member of editorial boards of Cognitive Development, Parenting Science and Practice, and the Journal for Research and Character Education. He is the recipient of the Kohlmarker Career Award for Outstanding Contributions to Research and Practice in Moral Education, awarded by the Association for Moral Education. Last but not least, Dr. Carlo is a Millsap Professor of Diversity and Multicultural Studies in the Department of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Missouri. His primary research interest is in the understanding the development of positive youth development and well-being in children and adolescents across the world. Many of his projects focused on U.S. ethnic racial groups, including Latino, Latina youth and families. He has published over 200 books, chapters, and research papers on this topic. He has also co-founded and directed efforts at improving education and well-being in U.S. ethnic and racial youth. So our first presenter will be Larry, and I will leave it to left.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. I was looking forward to this panel and also interacting with other people that you have at this meeting. What I'm going to talk about is what we've learned about how children and all of us think about morality, the cognitive side of things. And I want to begin by looking at what a young girl has to say. If we can go to the next slide. She's in a preschool in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and she's being asked about things that she's seeing take place. And so she's asked, "Did you see what just happened?" And she answers, "Yes, they were playing, and John hit him too hard." And then she's asked, "Is that something you're supposed to or not supposed to do?" And she says, "Not so hard to hurt." "Is there a rule about that?" And she says, "Yes." "Well, what is the rule?" And she says, "You're not to hit hard." "But what if there were no rule about hitting hard? Would it be all right to do then?" And she says, "No." She's asked, "Why not?" And her answer is, "Because he could get hurt and start to cry." Now let's contrast that with her responses to another kind of transgression. So she's asked, "Did you see what just happened?" And she says, "Yes, they were noisy." "Is that something you are supposed to or not supposed to do?" She says, "Not do." "Is there a rule about that?" And she says, "Yes, we have to be quiet." well, what if there were no rule? Would it be all right to do that? And she says, yes. Why? And her answer is, because there's no rule. And so if we can go to the next slide, what we hear in her, in this interview is that she's making a distinction between, issues of morality, which are actions that have an impact on other people. And so this is like when she was talking about hitting hard. And these are things that are evaluated not in terms of norms or rules, but in terms of the effects that these actions have on other people. So the development of our morality is around our understandings, our judgments, around issues that have to do with how our actions impact other people. And click. This is in contrast with the ways in which she talked about being noisy in the classroom. And this is an example of a societal convention, a social convention. And conventions are norms that are particular to a given setting or a particular cultural group or society. And they're variable. They can change from setting to setting. And this is because the actions they govern are neither right or wrong in and of themselves. They're wrong or right is a function of governing rules, governing norms. And finally, we go to the third one. We can differentiate between these issues of morality and convention from the things that we treat as personal or private, things that are matters of personal choice. So if I was there in person, I'd be asking those of you in the audience who have diaries or journals to let me know who you are, because I would ask if I could read them out publicly. And I'm betting that you would object, that you would, and if I was to ask, well, who should control this? You would say me. And so things like, I've chosen to wear a particular color shirt because I tend to like these sorts of colors. These are matters of personal choice, issues of privacy. And so we have these three dimensions of fairness, of convention, and of the personal. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. But in social life, often we have these things in overlapping or in conflict with each other. So these conceptual frameworks that we have are applied in context, either by subordinating things to one of these frameworks or in coordination. So the judgments that we make are often weighing and balancing these different considerations. And you may be thinking, well, how can one action have more than one of these frameworks? So just consider the following situation. 4 kids working together earn $10 delivering newspapers, back in the day when they delivered newspapers. Now they have a problem. How do we divide up the money? And so ask yourself, is this a math problem? Well, sure it is. How do you divide 10 4 ways? But it's more than that. It's a moral problem. How do we do this fairly? So in this one example, we have both math and morality. And I don't think you would try to raise math scores in the state of Virginia by doing a lot of moral discussion. In the same way, I don't think you do a lot of arithmetic problems as a way of developing morality. But you have these 2 conceptual frameworks then in order to solve this one social issue. So in our complex situations, particularly the things we're talking about with social justice, we often have the society's conventions in conflict with what we think is fair or right. We can go to the next slide. And to make things even more complicated, there are our informational assumptions, what we think is true about the world. So if we view a fertilized egg as a person, then early term abortion is taking the life of someone else. If we think of a fertilized egg as a fertilized egg or an embryo or whatever, then it's a different kind of a decision. Similarly with climate change, if we don't think that human beings are causing our problems with the climate, then there's no moral issue with using fossil fuels. We can go to the next slide. So another way to think about these domains is to, by analogy, think about how our visual system works. Our visual system is actually very, very elegant but simple. We have red-green receptors, we have blue-yellow receptors, and we have black-white. That's it. So some things in the world are red, some things in the world are green, some things are blue, some things are yellow, some black, some white, but we see a huge range of colors. And the way we do that is our brain coordinates from these different basic colors that generate all the things we see. So just to review, we have basic frameworks for understanding the socio-moral world. We have a moral framework, we have a framework for understanding convention or personal issues, and then we take into account informational assumptions. Next slide. Now, to make this even more interesting, there's development. And development in each of these domains is not linear. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 the way that we learned from Kohlberg. Instead, these are dynamic developmental systems that oscillate. So we have periods of affirmation and negation and then reaffirmation as we are building our deepening our understandings. So children in 5th grade affirm social convention as sort of organizing things so we don't have chaos. But then when they reach middle school, they reflect on it all and they conclude that conventions are nothing more than the arbitrary rules of authority. And if there are any middle school teachers in the audience, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not until they're sophomores in high school that they actually understand that these arbitrary rules, one at a time, are arbitrary, but collectively actually are the constituent elements of social systems and essential to group functioning. So think about this. It's not until high school that kids actually understand societies as systems. So we need to take this developmental progression into account. And these transition points are wonderful ones for getting kids to weigh and balance convention with morality. Similarly, if we go to the next slide, morality is also a U-shaped function where younger children and older adolescents come to moral conclusions that are more like one another than the conclusions arrived at by young adolescents. So what I'll just give you, illustrate this through an example. We ask kids to consider a child getting on a bus. It's an empty bus. And so now this child is on the bus by him or herself when another person gets on the bus, and the person getting on and paying their fare drops a $20 bill, and they're unaware that the money is on the ground. We then ask the kids, should the person who saw the money drop on the ground tell the other person that they've lost their money, or should you keep quiet and just sort of quietly go over and put it in your pocket? And it turns out that young kids and older adolescents pretty much all say you need to give the money back. And they give different forms of explanations, but that's their conclusion. Not with the early adolescents. They say things like, well, you didn't put your hand in their pocket. It fell on the ground, it's in nowhere land. And so they look at the complexity of the situation, and their chances of saying you should give the money back are exactly 50-50. Lesson here, don't drop your money in front of an 8th grader. So if you think about moral development, it's not straightforward, it's not linear, it's curvilinear. And the same thing for empathy and so on. Let's go on to the next one. So in summary, development is going to take place. We have these different domains of morality, convention, and the personal. Development takes place within each domain. With age, there's an increased capacity to balance things across domains. However, there are no fixed stages for these coordinations. And unfortunately, there's no developmental endpoint where morality takes priority. So we do not have a stage principled moral reasoning. We can go to the next slide. As I've described it, we are talking about normative moral development. And normative moral development generates what I refer to as nice people. People who don't just go out and steal and beat people up and so on. But they could very easily happily live with racism. They can live with sexism. They don't see the contradictions. They are simply being good in a conventional sense. Now, Kohlberg said the way that we get out of this, there's a stage of principled moral reasoning. But there is no such stage. We can go to the next slide. And in fact, we can't generate these principles as individuals. And the reason we can't generate these principles as individuals is that there isn't any way for us to really know what it is like to be someone whose positionality is really different from ourselves without somehow entering into dialogue with them. So principles that are really generative principles that fit everyone require sociogenetic processes and not just normative ontogenesis. Ontogenesis refers to individual development. We need some kind of collective process. So if we can go to the next slide. So there's discourse, but there are two views of discourse. One in which we engage in strategic and persuasive argumentation. And most of what we teach kids to do in American schools is to debate and to persuade. But Habermas, who's a European philosopher, has talked about another form of discourse, which is communicative, in which we search for common, agreed upon, and shared answers. We can go to the next slide. So what we are finding in our own research, and what I want to argue here is the way forward, is to engage students and teach them how to take a critical moral orientation to the world they've inherited, and to engage in what the political philosopher Tony Layden refers to as responsive engagement, in which we engage in collective reasoning, where we attempt to find common ground. So if we can go to the next slide. So what does this mean, and what does this look like in a classroom? I'm going to sum up this really fast and go to the next. Okay, we're going to engage in what we're calling transactive discourse. And a transact is where you actually seriously listen to the other person and you operate on the things that the other person said with the goal of finding commonality between conflicting positions. We can go to the next. So let's consider what would be involved in a complex socio-moral issue, the rights of transgendered students. If we do a domain analysis, we have morality, issues of fairness and rights. Next. Then we have issues of convention, the conventions that society sets for us around gender. Next. We have a whole lot of information assumptions about gender and sex. In fact, most people treat them as the same thing. Next. And then there are the personal goals of the transgendered student, as well as the other students interacting with one another, finally. So if we look at what's to take place in a dialogue in a classroom, it has the following components. Heteroglossia, this is a term from Bakhtin, and what it refers to is that we have a mixture of points of view and positionalities. A dialogic mindset, which is something that we need to teach American kids how to do, is to enter into a dialogue with the idea that it's a dialogue and not a thing that we have to win. Next. We also have to engage kids in evaluating facts and information, not just getting it from Fox News or CNN, but actually going and looking at what do we know about these issues. Next. And teaching kids how to engage in transactive discourse. So we have heteroglossia, dialogic mindset, looking at information, and engaging in transacts. Next. And finally, this is all operating with the goal of cross-domain coordination, of pulling things together in a way that all of this makes sense, not just for ourselves, but for all of us together. So we can go to the last slide. Okay, so thank you for your time. The website at the bottom, if you go there, you will see a lot more information about this and information about educational materials and things that can help you. I'm not there, so if you we'll have questions, obviously, but if you want to contact me, please email me. And thank you for this opportunity to speak with you.
Hi, for those of you that know anything about social domain theory at all, following Larry Nucci is incredibly intimidating within this field. Following virtual Larry might be okay, so I'm a little bit more comfortable with that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done that builds on some of the things that Larry introduced. Really thinking about how adolescent moral development relates to their civic moral reasoning and civic engagement. So start out with some couple of points that I think are going to be taken as for granted by people in this room. Civic engagement is an important part of development. It is critical for the forming of individual identities. It is an important part of who we are as individuals, but it's also very important for the continuation of democratic processes and healthy communities. Okay? And civic engagement takes many forms, and youth are involved in all of these different forms. So we can think of engagement as taking the form of civic activism, other forms of more conventional political action. Civic engagement includes environmental and conservation behaviors. It also includes more formalized volunteering or community service, as well as other forms of informal helping and pro-social behavior. So civic engagement is a diverse and multifaceted construct that really includes pro-social contributions to community and society that include both political and non-political involvement. And why is this important? Again, important for healthy democracy. Political philosophers have long argued that we need to have individuals engaged. It's important for healthy communities. It's also very important, both historically and currently, for solving social and societal problems and for addressing social injustice. So civic engagement is really important, and what I want to drive home is this point that includes a lot of different types of behaviors. So again, when we think about youth civic engagement and development, we're talking about both behaviors, including both non-political behaviors like volunteering, as well as different types of political action, both structured, kind of mainstream political behavior, as well as civic activism and social movement behavior, as well as environmental engagement. It also includes civic skills. This has been an aspect of civic development that researchers have been really interested in, the skills and assets that individuals have to be productive community members. But a lot of my research is focused on how adolescents think about civic action and how they reason about civic responsibility. And really that focuses in on socio-political values and civic beliefs. So a lot of my talk is going to focus in on these aspects, keeping in mind that beliefs and attitudes are only one component of this broad set of constructs. Okay, so a lot of my work and work in our area is focused on the intersection of moral development. As Larry kind of introduced, researchers in our perspective view moral development as this developmental process that is not uniform, that it has to do with how adolescents and individuals apply different types of moral and non-moral concepts to different types of behavior. In Larry's example, with the young girl describing a hitting situation, the individual is focused on and making decisions about behavior that's prohibited, what I can't do. And a lot of our work is really focused on what individuals should do, right? Their responsibility to contribute to society, to contribute both through political action as well as through non-political action. And this includes the judgments and justifications that individuals give for different types of involvement, okay? And this also includes individual variability in values, how individuals assess the importance of engagement and how they view social structure and the hierarchies that are involved in social structure. Okay, so a little bit about our methodology. Similar to what was described by Dr. Nucci, we ask adolescents a series of questions related to civic responsibility. So do individuals have to vote? Do individuals have to engage in community service or political protests? And from this, we can get at the different types of moral and non-moral concepts that adolescents are applying to civic engagement. A lot of our work is also interested in the variability in justifications, so how adolescents think about why people should be involved. And there we see a great deal of heterogeneity and individual variability in how people reason about this. Okay? But again, civic engagement is multifaceted, right? So it includes things like voting or standard political activities, activities that are working within mainstream political institutions, right? It also includes other forms of political activity like social movement or civic activism, where the goal is to influence policy, potentially change existing policies and laws by working outside of existing political structures. It includes pro-social behavior that is structured like volunteering and community service, and it also, that's what I have left, right? It scared me for a second. And environmental behaviors like conservation. What we found is that adolescents think differently about these forms of civic engagement and apply different types of of moral and non-moral concepts to these different types of behavior. Okay? So for instance, community service involves welfare, involves the helping to others, and this is viewed as highly obligatory by adolescents across samples. We have an obligation to help other individuals because of the welfare component, because it is a moral obligation stemming from how it affects other people's welfare. It helps them. Okay? We also find that adolescents apply more conventional reasoning to standard political involvement. As Larry noted, Dr. Nucci noted, conventional reasoning includes beliefs about the importance of activities for smooth social transitions or smooth operations of existing systems. Okay, so adolescents view these sorts of activities as being highly obligatory because they are kind of set citizenship responsibilities. Where we see a lot more heterogeneity is in how adolescents conceptualize social movement involvement. And again, social movement involvement involves protesting, boycotting products, and here we see individuals apply a variety of different types of reasoning. As Dr. Nucci described how individuals might there might be overlap in both moral and non-moral forms of reasoning. Here we also see a lot of variability, with some adolescents viewing social movement involvement as highly obligatory because of the potential moral effects that it can have on others and for changing existing policies, especially unfair policies or unjust policies. Okay, so really I think what this body of research tells us is something that might be, again, taken for granted by a lot of people in this room, is that adolescents are not apathetic. I think we have a lot of stereotypes about adolescents as being not interested in politics, as not caring about their communities. In our research across contexts in Southern California, urban areas of Minneapolis, rural and city areas within Appalachia have found that across those different contexts, adolescents actually view engagement with their communities through both political and non-political means as incredibly important and vital and obligatory for individuals. So some of the stereotypes that I think exist about adolescents, and I think that our panelists up here described this feeling of youth being viewed as being apathetic and as being not able to participate, doesn't actually match up with how adolescents actually view themselves in terms of their responsibility. Okay? The other thing that's important to note is that this is highly predicted by adolescents' experiences and behaviors. So adolescents that view engagement as being morally worthy are more likely to engage in that activity in the future. So these are not just abstract thoughts that adolescents have, but actually are strongly tied to their future involvement. So they might be important building blocks for assessing the ways in which we think about building citizens that are interested in making positive contributions to their communities. So civic experiences are important and lead to changes in reasoning. Adolescents that are more involved over time in our studies, we find that they view those activities as more obligatory, more morally worthy. We also find that there's a huge influence of socio and political discussions. So a lot of our work has looked at parents, but we found that also teachers and other youth mentors can have an effect on how adolescents conceptualize civic responsibility. So parents that view and stress the importance of different types of civic engagement, frame civic engagement as a moral activity, those adolescents are much more likely to view engagement from a moral perspective. Okay? But we also find a great deal, and I think it's important to note, that individuals aren't uniform in what types of activities they view as important. And here we find some consistent differences in by different facets of identity. So we find really across studies and across contexts, we find that male and female adolescents view civic responsibility differently. And I think this is really important because it speaks to how we frame civic engagement potentially differently for males and females, especially within service learning programs where there might be a stress on service. And Walker and others have argued that potentially that leads to engendered views of, or gender-specific views of what civic responsibility is. Okay? We also find that there's differences across race ethnicity, with our youth of color in our samples tending to prioritize non-mainstream forms of political engagement like social protest at a higher level than our white adolescents. And again, this makes sense given historic marginalization from mainstream political participation. And those youth, even though they're not necessarily participating in those activities, are aware of potentially those obstacles, and that changes how they view political participation, what they stress as being important. Okay. All right, so in addition to beliefs, we've also really assessed another form of cognition, and that is adolescents' values, and really how they interpret and view different types of social structures. So this plays a role in how adolescents understand aspects of societal institutions and political institutions, specifically inequality and hierarchies within contexts. And this leads to different views of critical reflection, or the ways that adolescents not only view inequalities as being present, but also judge those as being more or less wrong. There's a great deal of individual variability in those that is highly predicted by the different types of civic experiences that youth have. So civic experiences are also potentially important for helping adolescents realize the structural inequalities that are present in a number of social and political institutions. Okay, so I think we're going to have Dr. Ward talk a little bit more about some of these other constructs like critical consciousness, but we've also potentially looked at more negative political values, right? So that where adolescents might be more condoning or in favor of different types of inequalities present. And again, these are not necessarily things that we want to have adolescents develop. They're not positive views, but we found that they are strongly associated with the types of civic experiences they have, and also tend to vary across contexts. So thinking of adolescents as one uniform group that have a specific sort of views that are going to be consistent simply because they're youth is not been found in our research. Again, I think that shouldn't be surprising to most of the people in this room. We've also found a lot of variability in how adolescents actually view political leaders. So we actually have a current study right now where youth we asked them what they think of our current president. And we asked this in youth in Southern California and in Minnesota and in Appalachia. And what we find is a great deal of heterogeneity. And what I think really this points to is not only do youth view themselves as important, but they are incredibly sophisticated and nuanced in their understanding of political process, and they're usually not given credit for that sort of political and social sophistication. So that is, I think that's all I have. Am I doing it time? Okay. Oh, and I want to thank funding for the research, and I'm going into the next thing, sorry, and all the people that have helped me with the studies, including my former students and postdoctoral assistants and colleagues. So, thank you.
Okay, hi. How's everyone doing? Need to stretch out or something? Do a little yoga? So I'm really honored to be here, and I thank the organizers of this conference. My first thought when I was invited was, I don't do a lot of applied work, so maybe they are thinking of some other guy named Carlo, but I think I'm really glad that I'm here in a sense, because I understand the conference is about focuses on moral reasoning and social justice, and clearly I believe a lot of my work has relevance to that. But I'm also sort of feeling like I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball here a little bit, in the sense that I'm not just going to talk about moral reasoning, I'm also going to talk about moral emotions. And I'm also going to focus a little more on behaviors. It's nice that Aaron was, Dr. Metzger, was just speaking about civic engagement, because the behaviors that I'm mostly interested in are pro-social behaviors. So if we think about all of the sort of things that are happening right now in our current society, which are very troubling, to say the least, there are a number of issues that are not just issues that we could discuss, have dialogues about, think about critically and logically and rationally, but these are also important issues because they're very powerful issues, because they're emotional issues, right? And in fact, as we were talking this morning about how to engage people in dialogue and engage people in these sorts of ways of fostering moral reasoning and higher critical thinking, and get people to sort of understand other people's situations and whatnot, I think there's a really important first step that is really necessary, and that is for people to be open to engaging in that sort of dialogue, and for people to be willing to engage, and to be motivated to engage, and to be motivated to change whatever perspective they may endorse in that dialogue. So in the traditional moral development literature, there's sort of been, very simplistically speaking, sort of two general approaches. One that really focuses on, as Dr. Nucci referred to, the justice and issues of fairness and welfare and so forth. And most of that work has been, was pioneered by Larry Kohlberg and others. And as Dr. Metzger mentioned, a lot of that work really focuses on law breaking and transgressive contexts. It emphasizes thoughts and reasonings, and it really develops, at least early on, from concerns with punishment, consequences, and authority issues. And then it sort of develops to the sort of higher order principles and norms. The other approach is sort of, it's been termed different things, but you can term it the care and interpersonal oriented approach. And this is really in the context, thinking about moral development in the context of relationships, interpersonal relationships, and group dynamics. And it also is in the context of moral emotions, especially empathy and sympathy for one another. In this sort of approach, both reasoning and emotions are critically important. Both are relevant, especially if we want to ultimately understand social justice and issues of social justice and injustice, and strive towards goals that consider the welfare of others. In Eisenberg's levels of pro-social moral reasoning, for example, and this is under the care interpersonal orientation, there are similarities to the development of moral reasoning in Kohlberg's approach. That is, you go from sort of more self-centered sort of concerns to more other-oriented concerns. We're not going to go into details on any of this, and you can't read that, so I'm sorry about that, but you can email me later if you'd like. But one of the things that we find that's really important and distinct from the Kohlbergian sort of traditional approach, well, there's a couple of things. One is that, for example, we find that children use a lot of empathic reasoning. So they actually, even from early on, they're considering the needs of others. And, we have this, there's sort of a myth sometimes that kids are egoistic little brats and, they don't really think about others, they're hitting others, blah, blah, blah. But actually, little kids are also very able to consider the psychological and physical needs of others. And if you think about it and step back, you actually see demonstrations of that in very young children. The other thing that sort of is really interesting that is also quite different is that, in fact, you don't see a lot of reference to authority or punishment. Now, these are scenarios that are quite different than the ones used in the Kohlbergian sort of approach, because, again, these are not transgressive situations, but these are more what I consider to be more everyday kinds of situations, or perhaps not more everyday, but also common other types of common everyday situations. These are situations where you see someone that's hurt, that's falling off a bike or something like that, and the question is, do you stop to help that person, or do you continue to go to some important social event that you need to get there on time for, or you see a car that's disabled on the side of the road and you're on your way to some important job interview or something like that. So these are dilemma situations where you have to consider the needs of someone else and contrast it with your own personal needs. And of course, I think we can all relate to these kinds of situations. The other aspect to this care interpersonal approach is considering the role of empathy and sympathy. There are other moral emotions that I could certainly speak to, but we don't really have the time: guilt, shame, and so forth. But I did want to point out a few things about what we know about empathy development and sympathy development. First of all, definition. Empathy is a matching of emotion with someone else. So, Nancy wins the lottery and she's really happy. I could be happy for her. And that matching of emotion is empathy. or it could be a negative valency emotion. It could be sad, someone's pet died, I could be sad because they're sad, I'm sad. But empathy can be positive or negative. Sympathy, on the other hand, is what is actually conceptually linked to prosocial behaviors, to helping others or to wanting to assist others. And sympathy is defined as feelings of concern or sorrow for someone else. So even if that other person doesn't evoke sadness, you might still know about their situation and feel sorry for them, right? So if you hear about the plight of children that are experiencing famine in a faraway sort of place, you can feel sad for the plight of those kids or those families, even though you don't necessarily see those cues right there in front of you. You don't necessarily know their actual situation. And this brings me to an important aspect of empathy and sympathy development, and that is that it does develop. So in babies, we see emotional contagion. You ever see one baby start crying and everybody starts crying? That's emotional contagion. And there's some debate about whether that's actual empathy or whether it's just babies that are, hearing some loud aversive noise and so they start crying. But nonetheless, we also do see mimicking in babies, and that seems to be a very important precursor to empathy and sympathy. But empathy and sympathy also require good emotion regulation. And emotion regulation is not only important for empathy and sympathy, but we argue that it's also important for moral reasoning, for moral dialogue, and for higher order principles and norms. So it is very difficult to dialogue with someone if they're yelling at you and if you're yelling at them, So there requires a really important aspect of regulation. At the highest levels of empathy and sympathy development, there is the ability to go from the sort of one-on-one, more immediate, empathic, sympathetic response to the more abstract example that I gave earlier about the plight of kids that you might not even have ever met or seen in person. And you can imagine that that higher level form of empathy and sympathy is something that doesn't really emerge until early adolescence. And even then, of course, we know in some individuals, like political leaders, they never develop that ability. Anyway, nothing more to say on that. Sorry, slipped. Okay. But moving beyond moral reasoning and empathy and sympathy, it's really also important to look at how these things jointly function in predicting prosocial behaviors. And prosocial behaviors, Dr. Metzger gave us sort of already some rationale for the importance of civic engagement, which is obviously a form of prosocial behavior. But it has a lot of really important qualities to it. And I'm not going to go through with each of these things because I don't have a lot of time, but in the end, one of the things I do want to highlight is the importance of how prosocial behaviors, the role that prosocial behaviors play in us forming new relationships, right? If you think about how is it that you make a friend with someone, or how is it that you develop a close, intimate, romantic relationship with someone, or how is it that you would consider the qualities of a good marital relationship or a good romantic relationship. Hopefully, those two individuals are engaging in reciprocal prosocial behaviors, right? Well, if we have difficulties in fostering prosocial behaviors in our society, in our youth, in our society, then one of the downsides, potential risks, is that we risk marginalizing and socially isolating groups of individuals, including youth of color. So it's really important that we look and consider prosocial behaviors. Oops. I'm not going to go through this. This was kind of a cute little thing, and I don't know how it got there, but I didn't expect it to be there, but I'm just going to go to here. Okay. Wow. Okay. I think I maybe have the wrong version. I sent this a while ago, so. Okay, so moral reasoning is important. All of this is not to say that moral reasoning, moral dialogue is not important. Of course, it's very important. And in fact, it's very important for the ultimate successful integration of immigrants and youth of color, minorities. But we would argue that empathy-related traits are also important, and more importantly, the interplay of moral reasoning and empathy and how they work together. So you could imagine, for example, if you empathize with a group, if you identify with a group, if you perceive them as similar to yourself, then that might facilitate moral dialogue with that other person and might ultimately facilitate higher forms of moral reasoning, and vice versa. Moral reasoning and moral norms might induce empathic and sympathetic responses as well. And both of these sort of processes can together work to reduce social and ultimately social injustice and promote global harmony. I think also the study of prosociality in general is very important, and it's often been sort of neglected or minimized or sometimes ignored in some of the traditional work, because we are talking about fostering this incredible positive assets, right? This incredible, not only intrapersonal characteristic, but also an interpersonal characteristic. And so I think it helps us to reframe youth development, especially youth of color development, in a much more strength-based and asset-based sort of framework, which is really important, because it's not just important to come up with programs that reduce violence, but we need to come up with programs that foster positive social interpersonal relationships and behaviors. And to that, I think in our work, we've identified a number of cultural assets and strengths that are linked to pro-social behaviors, and we believe are ultimately linked to social justice. And I'll just mention a few of them. So there are things in the ecology of Latino youth, youth of color in general, discrimination experiences, cultural stressors, traumatic experiences that can challenge and undermine pro-social behaviors and make it difficult for those youth to sort of manifest these pro-social tendencies, which again can ultimately lead to the sort of marginalization, social isolation, feed into that sort of cycle that we find much too often. And then, of course, there are values and there are strengths and assets, such as cultural values. So we have done a lot of work looking at the importance of the family unit, or familismo, what we call in Latino cultures. And we find that this culture of familismo is very important in predicting prosociality. Why? Because the family is that sort of one of those early units, venues, contexts where kids learn to be prosocial with one another, and then hopefully they generalize that prosociality beyond that. Okay, so I'm going to acknowledge a number of people that have worked on this, and I'm sorry for the mix-up in terms of the slides. I was going to give you some more stuff, but I want to thank you all for listening very much. Oh, there's the slide that I was looking for. But, and, oh my God. Oh, well, I am getting out of here. How do I get out of here? How do I get out of here? And that's not working. Oh, okay. Whew. Sorry.
Okay, I'd like to thank first the folks who convened this conference. This is really very cool. I'm looking forward to having lots of great conversations with all of you here. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I have the unenviable task of standing between you and lunch. But I am here to offer another perspective to moral reasoning by focusing our attention on race, identity, and social justice. So to begin, a profound corrective regarding the matter of social justice within the African American imaginary was laid bare this past August when the New York Times published an unparalleled and highly ambitious series of articles designed to reorient our collective view of the founding of this nation. By marking the significance of the year 1619, the authors called attention to the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Black enslaved bodies at Port Comfort in the British colony of Virginia, thus introducing to America slavery, this nation's original sin. The authors sought to place the context and consequences of slavery, as well as the contributions of Black Americans to resist those conditions, at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Of the many stories this nation has told itself about Black people are those that claim we are lazy, immoral, ignorant, and unworthy, that our families are pathological and pathogenic, our social problems are our own making. At the center of this amazing piece of journalism was the desire to urge the reading public to consider what it would take for the United States to live up to its own ideals. What if finally, the authors asked, in this 400th year, America understood that we have never been the problem, but could perhaps be the solution? And while scholars and pundits argue over whether the task of reframing American history through the prism of slavery and racism will or will not bring the people of our divided nation closer together, or even to a shared understanding of our past, African Americans, the group most keenly aware of how the legacy of slavery continues to define life in the United States, are the very people who have fought the hardest to make the ideals of freedom and equality a reality for all. Now, even today, the exclusion of African Americans from the boundary in which, as Opatow has argued, moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply, presents formidable barriers to political, economic, and social advancement for Black people. This moral exclusion has led to the lack of resources, financial struggles, hardships, and negative health outcomes for many African American families. For Black and other children of color in schools, this is most evident in their overrepresentation in special education classes, suspension and expulsion rates, and the disparities in high school graduation rates for Black, Latinx, and white students. There are existing disparities in children's health that are the direct product of poverty and structural racism. Children from lower income communities and communities of color often have greater risk of exposures to pollution, higher levels of contaminants in their bodies, and more illness or disability, such as asthma and learning challenges. For these and many other reasons, Black parents have long known that raising Black children is a moral imperative. As the great orator, abolitionist, and philosopher Frederick Douglass once said, "It is easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men." Racial socialization is a critical aspect of Black children's moral development. The guiding question that illuminates the socialization and educational agenda for Black youth then becomes, how can we help Black youth to grow strong and wise within the often toxic and unjust American context in which they develop? So let's turn our attention for a moment to the 6 key competencies of positive youth development that originated from the developmental assets framework posited by the Search Institute. And it highlights the following positive experiences and qualities that influence young people's development and call for varying degrees of proficiency and skills. These competencies include competence, a positive sense of one's actions in domain-specific areas like school and the work world; confidence, an internal sense of positive self-worth and self-efficacy; character, a respect for societal and cultural rules and a sense of morality; connection, which speaks to positive bonds with people and institutions that are reflected in bi-directional exchanges; caring, a sense of empathy; and contribution, which speaks to giving back to the community. Now, in 2016, Clonan, Roy, Jacobs, and Nakula modified the PYD model, recognizing that certain factors make some children more vulnerable than others, i.e., race and ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation or gender identity, and disability. These psychologists suggest that we integrate theoretical perspectives emerging from critical race feminism and other critical inquiries. And this has led to the addition of the role of resistance and resilience in the positive development of historically marginalized youth populations. More specifically, they highlight the importance of developing critical consciousness to critique and respond to gender and racial oppression. A strong critical consciousness adopted in the service of developing healthy resistance strategies and promoting resilient processes in the face of social adversity is shown to be fundamental for Black adolescent and young adult populations. The initial 6 competencies, plus the additional focus on critical consciousness, resistance, and resilience, work together to enhance young people's ability to achieve healthy development in the face of institutional racism and gender-based oppression. So, what does this look like? Now, both qualitative and quantitative research is replete with evidence showing the myriad ways in which Black youth experience everyday discrimination. You're treated with less courtesy than other people. You're treated with less respect than other people. You receive poorer service than other people at restaurants and in stores. People act like they think you are not smart. People act as if they are afraid of you. People act as if they think you are dishonest. People act as if they are better than you. You're called names or insulted. You are threatened or harassed. And with this reality as a backdrop, the developmental work becomes one of helping youth to build the developmental capacities to prepare for and resist race-related bias and discrimination. This includes resisting dominant and deficit-oriented attitudes, behaviors, and perspectives. It's a tough job to help teens develop a consciousness of the social and political context in which they reside and know the constraints they are operating under, all while staying positive enough to take calculated risks to meet their goals. The history of African Americans in this nation has been one of belonging to a group whose very survival has depended on our collective ability to resist social and psychological annihilation. That means knowing that the path is not always clear, yet you have to find a way to keep on keeping on. In the effort to prevent Black children's internalization of negative racial messages and related beliefs, especially those that can contribute to the adoption of problematic behaviors, researchers have found that youth who receive counter-narratives that proffer an awareness of racism and provide coping strategies might be better psychologically prepared to cope with bias and discrimination. Those counter-narratives, explicating the moral reasoning of the marginalized, teach lessons that emphasize racial resistance and the resilience we need to bounce back when we fall, indeed, that give us a reason to bounce back and provide us with both a compass and a map. So adolescence is a period of renegotiation of social relationships and power dynamics. It's a time in which we hope that Black youth will secure the skills necessary to grow up confident and secure in one's personal identity and in one's identification with other people of African descent. In my own research, I've learned that African American youth must stand ready and able to resist externally imposed definitions of what it is to be Black and male or female, queer or gender nonconforming, or whatever self-concept one derives from their perceived membership in a relevant social group. The development of healthy racial identity is about embracing the fact of racial identity without adopting a victim ideology and without becoming racist. This orientation to one's racial identity serves three purposes: to forewarn and prepare, to connect with others, and to resist oppression. Now, one thing I have to add is that I know, as we all do, that Black youth are not a monolith. Our community encompasses African American, Caribbean, Afro-Latinx, African immigrants. We are not all the same, and thus we need ideological diversity to survive in a diverse and complex world. Racial socialization, parenting practices, and ideological differences in Black thought diverge and converge in many different ways across our populations. But for today, I'm focusing on what we have learned from the African American experience, since that's where the numbers are the largest and there is the most research. So the development of critical consciousness. Like many of you, I work in a university surrounded by a growing number of social justice warriors, young people who are becoming more woke and aware to social political realities and their accompanying stressors. Many young adults struggle to know how to effectively respond to societal inequities. Often these issues raise our anxieties. They shut us down psychologically. They make us angry and frustrated, and they activate our resistances. Sometimes these students come to me and want to talk about how in Black families, these healthy and effective resistance strategies can be inculcated. We talk about how Black folks have always believed that racism must be exposed to be eradicated, and that we've always emphasized the importance of critical consciousness. Why? To counter the myriad distortions, mistruths, and misinformations perpetuated about the lives of Black women and men, their families and communities. And additionally, critical consciousness is about teaching children and youth how to read their world, how to situate themselves and others within systems of oppression, and how to effectively challenge attitudes, beliefs, and practices that normalize social injustice at the individual, institutional, and cultural levels. Why else? Because critical consciousness allows us to name the who, what, when, where, how, and to know what is best to do with the information one has. So critical consciousness helps us to engage in critical dialogue and challenge the status quo. Now, for many years, I've thought about the role of resistance in the psychological and social development of Black youth. largely as a quality of mind and character that needs to be nurtured in the hearts and minds of young individuals. This population is actively working to define itself, their values, and their perspectives, and the parameters of culture. Many are refusing to accept externally derived kinds of definitions. They're consciously fostering resistance as a tool of psychological warfare against widespread silence about the malevolent reality of white racism, sexism, gender bias, and dissemination of information about Black people, as well as the denial of the lived experience of racial injustice and inequality. I've identified the many complicated ways that youth can develop unhealthy resistance strategies, strategies that are self-destructive, which means that they can impair people psychologically by diminishing their self-esteem, undermining self-efficacy, and destroying a sense of self. Some youth adopt behaviors that lead them to behave in ways that cause injury to themselves and may also create negative reactions in others. Elsewhere, I have called these resistance for survival strategies. They tend to be short-term and nearsighted. They focus on the immediate, how does this affect me today, rather than on the larger picture, how can this make lasting improvements for me and for the entire community? They fail to provide tools that transfer to future crises in effective ways. And they fail to provide real control over a damaging situation. Instead, they often leave people disempowered, ineffective, and unable to make the change that could bring them the respect, value, and relief that they seek. Now, I contrast that with the work that we have to undertake to nurture a more healthy, indeed liberatory resistance. It builds on the African American liberation tradition, and it's in the hearts and the minds of Black youth. This orientation operates from an awareness of the socio-political context of race in America and the role that racism, sexism, and other social biases continues to play in shaping the beliefs, values, and behaviors of Americans of all colors. It assists in developing the ability to withstand negative social influences and to take a stand for those things that provide positive self-validation and group affirmation. It encourages youth to seek solutions that empower them through both a positive sense of self and the strengthening of connections to broader communities, thus expanding the moral community too many of us have been excluded from. And finally, it's about helping Black youth to identify and reject unhealthy resistance when they see it in others or in themselves. And so, I did that one. So to finish up, I see resistance, as I have articulated it, as a critical praxis for doing social justice work. I often tell a story of a protester at a Black Lives Matter rally, as it illuminates the dialectic between resistance and resilience. Fueled by frustration and sorrow, he and the other protesters rallied to march, chant, sing, cry out to anyone who would listen. Through it all, and amidst the pain, is the motivation to act. He explained, "The more demonstrations I see, the less rage I feel." His resilience allows him to negotiate these hard times by resisting effectively in social protest, and that successful negotiation facilitates further resistance. Resistance for liberation in the Black community and family provides a preventive psychosocial intervention that boosts hardiness and psychological resilience in Black family members. Resistors for liberation are, in turn, resilient. And that dialectic is an integral part of the African American tradition. Thank you.
right, Larry.
So yes, as I said, this is the dream team. I'm so excited about their panel, and I thought it was wonderful. And I want to open it up to questions. So anybody who has any questions, we can get. Yes, there's a mic right here, so you could just wait for the mic. Yes, there's somebody back there.
Thank you. So I'm really excited about this panel, but I'm wondering if the panelists could talk a little bit about why there's so much of a disconnect between the people who study critical consciousness and the people who study moral reasoning. And how do you bridge that gap?
I guess I can start. I think that's a really good question, and I think it's actually, within the moral development literature, it is an issue, but also I think within civic engagement research more generally, I think that there tends to be two literatures that are not really in conversation with each other. The PYD, the positive youth development literature, and the critical consciousness literature are often described as different pathways for different kids. And I think that there's been a lot of discussion about integrating those perspectives, and I think that Dr. Ward's work, I think, is really a step toward thinking about how those processes might play a role. I can talk a little bit about our own work, which I have a graduate student who's actually looking at intersections between critical reflection across different types of issues and moral development. So I think you're absolutely right. There is more of a need for research in that area, and I think that critical reflection is itself a moral reasoning process. It is a way of understanding social structures and making judgments about those, and includes informational assumptions, as Larry talked about. So there is more room for that work, and I think it can make a huge difference in our understanding of these processes for sure. So that's, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I would certainly agree with that. Is this on?
Oh, I think you just hit that.
Oh, it is. Okay. I would definitely agree with what Dr. Metzger just said, and I would also add that I've been around long enough to see how how intellectual ideas come and go. And while Freire was really big for a while in the 80s within, amongst a particular group of intellectuals, it sort of died down a bit, and now this idea of critical consciousness and people building on it has come back. And not only has it come back, but it has come back and made its way into many different disciplines in ways that it hadn't before. So I think that that's part of it, but probably the biggest part of it is very much that we are trained in these silos, and we often don't pay any attention to what's going on outside of our silo, which is really sad.
I don't think this one is on. Sure. Have you turned it on? Hello? Okay.
Oh, there it is.
So it's an excellent question, and I think as a grad student, I was sort of taken aback by that sort of disconnect myself. I do agree that there is now more work in this area. But it does, I think if you want to think about the reason for it, part of it is also the fact that I think the early theories in moral development were not comprehensive enough, were not eclectic enough. In the work that we've been doing, focusing on mostly Latino, Latina, Latinx youth, we've actually taken a much more comprehensive approach into looking at the things that predict ethnic identity, for example, the things that predict these cultural values that I think are really important, racial socialization processes. And we find that those sorts of processes and those constructs, those notions of ethnic identity, cultural values, biculturalism, and those are actually linked to pro-social behaviors, pro-social development. but I don't feel like there is enough of this sort of work happening, and there is still somewhat of a disconnect. I just came from the Association for Moral Education Conference, and I always sort of feel like an odd duck at those conferences because there's still a lot of somewhat more narrow sort of theoretical conceptions on moral development.
I think Larry wants to say something, yeah.
Well, actually, I just came from a conference on moral education in which was a young man named Winston Thompson and a new PhD, Robin Hilton G. It was a session on exactly this, moral education for social justice. And in fact, we're in the process of writing a book with that title as a function of trying to reconcile the ways in which most urban education programs are social justice based and bringing the sort of moral developmental perspective and integrating it. And it's been a surprise to us that this hasn't been done before. So you're raising an important problem. That we're looking at dynamic developmental systems that we can't just take one part of it, the reasoning part, and disconnect it from the experiential part. And we can't just do the sort of social justice reasoning without looking at what critical race theory and critical theory tell us. So the future's good. I think people are actually paying attention to this. So your question's incredibly timely. And in 2 years from now, you're going to see a bunch of this stuff come out.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? Somebody right there.
Hi, well, first of all, this is a great panel, thank you. And I'm processing the political science aspect of the democracy context that we're talking about. And just thinking about this morning's panel and using dialogue and then thinking about moral reasoning and social justice. And if there's any thoughts about I feel like this is leading towards a change in the social contract or establishing a new social contract for our democracy. And I was just wondering if that kind of intersection ever comes up in this conversation.
Could you say a little more about the social contract that I want to make sure that we're on the same page here.
Yeah, no, and this is coming from a political science background,
Sure.
and our organization is focused on helping young people develop skills to become citizens in a pluralistic democracy, and doing that by working with, for a year, with people from really different backgrounds in their communities. And a lot of the work that we have to do to bring people together from really different backgrounds is around establishing within their teams kind of the equivalent of a social contract for how they're going to work together over the next year. And the role that dialogue plays in that, and the last presentation around race and identity. Yeah, so I'm just curious about about social contracts and whether or not we see this work as contributing to that kind of new social contract in a democracy. And maybe that's like too far out for this.
Are you feeling better?
Well, I think it is a little beyond the work that we do in our lab and our research. But as I mentioned earlier, I believe that the work that we're doing has implications for establishing those sorts of contracts, establishing those working group rules and relationships. We view pro-social development, pro-social behaviors, empathy, and all those sorts of things as important contributing factors that facilitate the development of those kinds of agreements. And I think I view those as really foundational for if we are to really move beyond the old sort of contracts that exist and into new territory. And I think, some of the other things that other panelists were talking about are also very important for that, because it is a matter of, gaining understanding about different perspectives, but also, as I mentioned, I see it as also being motivated to gain that understanding and being motivated to reach those new sorts of agreements. And so, there was a time when in psychology motivation mattered, and I still think it really is very, very important. It really helps us to differentiate between those sorts of groups that are quite vocal and those that are less vocal. So it's that intersectionality that you're speaking to, I think, is very, very important. And we need to find ways to understand what motivates people, as well as what, sort of how their thinking and their dialogue skills develop and how we can foster those skills.
I think I saw some questions. Yeah.
Thank you for a really exciting panel, really great topics and discussion. And one of the things I was thinking about, and something that I think about in my own work, is, and notice in some of the critical consciousness research and whatnot, is sort of what we're being critically conscious about. And that often it seems like this conversation is mostly on the side of oppression. And so how do we think about oppressed groups and critical consciousness development for them to acknowledge the structures and respond? But then how do we think about the privileged side of this and what white youth are being critically conscious about? So it's not just maybe how white young people are thinking about the other and thinking about marginalization, but how are they thinking about privilege as well, and positionality and whiteness? And so just thinking about, if you guys have thoughts on that in your work, or what we need to be doing to make sure our conversations about resistance and critical consciousness are not only about young people of color grappling with oppression, but also dismantling white supremacy and whiteness.
Well,
That's a simple one.
the slide that I did not share with you because I had already gone over time, was one in which I wanted us to think about this question. What happens when the standard bearer of moral teaching becomes unreliable? And that has stayed with me for quite a while. I work with largely white students, largely women, who are extraordinarily interested in going into communities of color and improving the lot of those people, right? And while that is a wonderful motivation, we all know that that can lead to all sorts of different problems. And so it becomes that doing social justice on somebody else, but not on me, right? And sometimes folks are willing to, they're not willing to do the work of critical engagement or challenging the status quo or situating themselves within systems of oppression. That is just too hard, too complicated, too painful to take on. It's a whole lot easier to adopt that charity mentality that, those poor people need me kind of thing. I think in colleges across the country, people who are working in service learning, and probably there are other disciplines that are taking this question on and really thinking about how do you create dialogues so that both groups are really learning as much about the other as they are also about themselves. And what does the work of, what does the self-work look like for students who have more privilege than others? So, it's a perfect question. It is the question of our times. I think it is a question that speaks volumes to those of us who are interested in moral development and moral reasoning, and it's something we have to work on.
Yeah. And with that, unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'm good.
No, you should respond.
I'm definitely not keeping this group from lunch.
Oh, it's not lunch, it's a video. Yeah, no, you're good. Sure. Well, yeah, no, speak. Speak.
I was just going to say that I think that's a really important question that our group has really been wrestling with, because we have measures of critical reflection for youth from 4th grade to 12th grade across 5 years, different geographic areas, race, ethnicities. And I think what was in your question is what I wish we would have measured, hindsight being what it is, because I think that it's a difference between being reflective and understanding that there is hierarchies than positioning yourself, as you said, and actually understanding that I actually have the privilege. I think that those aren't necessarily correlated, and but we are going to be able to look at it. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how the implications for civic engagement within different groups, because we do know that critical reflection is associated with engagement, especially specific types of political engagement for ethnic minority youth, but we don't necessarily know how that plays out for other youth. So I think that that's an important question that we're kind of right in the middle of wrestling with. So that's all I would say.
And I'm excited to say the person who just asked that question will be on the next panel, so get excited. Yes, Nancy has a video for us to share.
Well, first, let's thank the panel.